So hello, welcome to my session, Identity on the Front Line. I am for customer service. My name is Erin Crow, and I manage the user authentication product team at AWS. I started my journey at Amazon almost 10 years ago, but maybe not in a place that you would expect. I started in a call center, taking Kindle customer service calls for Amazon. And in the years in between, I've worn many different hats. I eventually led the retail customer service identity team through their strategy and implementation, doing everything from building the services of privilege management and identity management for our Amazon scale customer service team to authenticating the callers that were contacting us in the call centers and everything in between. So as I've grown as an identity practitioner and professional, I feel the privilege of having gotten to continue wearing this frontline hat throughout all stages of my journey, and I'm looking forward to sharing some of it with you. Before we get into it proper, just by a show of hands, is there anybody here that does this today? Either you're part of a customer service team or part of the security group that works with your customer service team? I'm so excited. Yeah, I know these folks. I used to work with them. I'm so excited to see so many hands raised because when I first started talking about this topic a couple years ago, I wouldn't see any hands in the audience. And sometimes when I would come to these sessions, people wouldn't really understand, well, why are we going to spend time talking about customer service at a security conference? So we're going to talk a little bit about why we need to continue talking about customer service at every identity and security conference that we go to. We're going to cover what it is that makes customer service environments so special. What are the types of conditions that differentiate them from other environments that we would be working to secure? We're going to cover what are the different use cases, the risks that we have in this environment, what are the tools at your disposal, what are the different considerations that you have and trade-offs that you have to consider as you weigh which ones you're going to use. A quick note on scope, we are mostly going to focus on what is the end user human-to-human interaction. I think there's actually a lot of overlap with help desk use cases, with chat and phone automation. Workforce management also has differentiations. But for the sake of time, we're going to focus on that. So we'll dive right into what are the use cases and risks. What is the ecosystem that we're dealing with here? The nexus of this environment is usually considered to be in the call center. But it can be anywhere that your user is interfacing with your customer service for help. It could be like an in-store kiosk if you have a retail business. Customers have sky-high expectations of our teams, that they're going to be able to help them out of absolutely any jam. Your customer doesn't care if they're calling you while they're driving down the highway at 90 miles an hour with their children screaming in the back as they balance a cheeseburger between their knees. They still expect that you're going to be able to help them no matter what. But there is a significant differentiator and limitation here, which is in the communication channel. Most businesses' customer service models still expect and support that customers will be largely calling us over the phone, as opposed to going through like online chat services. This is limiting because it prevents us from being able to do the same kinds of validation and verification that we would do in browsers. So what are the use cases that are common in these environments? These are going to be as varied as your business. You'll probably have as many customer service teams as you have lines of business. These use cases can range from things that seem innocuous and transactional, things like, where is this order that you were supposed to send me? Please send me this replacement for this defective thing, to things that strike a little bit closer to the heart of our user's identity. This could include help with servicing data subject access and compliance requests, validating our customers for those purposes. And then for many businesses also, customer service is still the last line of defense that we have in account recovery cases. So if you lose access to that embarrassing primary school email address, or you are a SaaS administrator that drops your very last YubiKey down a sewer grate, customer service is still usually the last place that you can turn to recover your account. In order to service these different use cases, your customer service agents are going to have access to a lot of different personally identifying information, as well as tooling that wouldn't typically be available to either your customer or to your support staff or to your corporate staff without having some kind of advanced kind of sign-in assessment, without having access to advanced and privileged tools. They'll be able to view, modify different personally identifying information, payment instruments, billing information, things like that. Think about for yourself the last time that you contacted your hospital's billing department or something like that, and you made a payment. When you were asked to provide your payment instrument, were you patched over to an automated system where you could enter your credit card and presumably it was been encrypted in some database and the agent didn't have to interact with it? Or did the business have to ask you to just provide your credit card number, your bank account number even over the phone, and you don't really know what happened to that afterwards? For most organizations, it is still going to be the latter. Of course, if we have account recovery use cases, we have to have privileges to modify or mutate actual customer credentials. This could be things like their email, their password. The problem here, of course, is that if this is performed without appropriate authorization from the customer, or even if there's a mistake made, someone fat fingers a password or the email or something to that degree, this is then going to prevent the customer from later remediating any mistakes and recovering again on their own. Some businesses will also give their agents the option to modify the account status. This could mean suspending it, suspending services. You call and you say, hey, I have unauthorized charges on my account. Typically, customer service agents are going to be able to help you suspend that account until the investigative team can go and clean up your account. Finally, some organizations will take it a step further and actually give customer service agents the ability to act on behalf of their user as if they were the user themselves. They could be giving them the ability to place orders on the user's behalf. They could be giving them, say, like screen share and action taking over screen share privileges, which is very important because if you don't have additional appropriate controls in place, auditing, logging, if you have a question of internal unauthorized use later, these changes can be very difficult to unwind from what the actual customer did versus what your agent did. So what are your primary objectives in this space? There's several different ways that we could rate these, and there's some overlap between these, but for the purpose of orienting our discussion today, I'm going to talk about them in terms of preventing account takeover and fraud and preventing data exposure. Humans are, generally speaking, biased to empathy, and this is also very true for our customer service teams. Our customer service teams are trained to be as helpful as possible and to solve whatever problem that your customer comes up with. Unfortunately, the problem is that threat actors also know this. Various reports like the Verizon data breach report, several others will attribute last year's attacks with anywhere between 30 to 90% of social engineering as some degree of the root cause or another human element. Obviously, this is a big range because of the different ways that we classify human element attacks, but even if we are to take the lower end of that range at 30%, it becomes very obvious why it's so essential to secure this readily available human interface to your organization. A note on data exposure. So in order to do their jobs, your customer service agents are going to have access to some degree of data for validation, for solving the problems. But it's extremely important to implement controls that minimize access to privileged data without appropriate context for the type of contact that your customer service agent is working on, if they're supposed to be scheduled for that day, so on. There are many different controls that can be used. This is, of course, because there is the opportunity for internal misuse, as well as for social engineers to work through your customer service team to try to get sensitive information about your customer. And there's a special note that I would like to underscore here, which is that although we don't want to, businesses can plan to absorb some degree of fraudulent charges as the cost of doing business. We can return that money to our customers. And also, even in many account takeover cases, we can take the appropriate actions to remediate, to clean up the account, and to return access to our customers. But the impacts of data exposure can be a lot harder to unwind. Even pieces of information that they don't contain PII, they don't otherwise seem sensitive, can have impacts for our customers that are hard for us to understand. For example, if your customer is a victim of domestic violence, if they're a member of the gay community, if they're part of a religious or ethnic minority in a country that is not friendly to that group of people, information about their whereabouts, their shopping habits, their personal interests, even what their reading list is, can be sensitive in ways that is really difficult for us that are not part of those groups to intuitively understand. So even very small pieces of data need to be incorporated in your plan. So that's a bit of a heavy backdrop. What are the tools that we have available to work with in this environment? For many organizations, I would say most, the primary and often and usually the first security interaction that you have with customer service is going to be the initial act of authentication, verifying that somebody is who they claim to be. And this is where we're going to start to see terms that are more familiar to us as identity practitioners, because there is no special sauce in customer service. We're working with the same kinds of factors, something that you know, something that you have, something that you are. But again, that communication channel challenges the way that we can apply these. and forces us to look at some methods that have some caveats that we wouldn't otherwise consider acceptable in like a computer or online environment. So we'll talk a little bit about what those methods are that are commonly adapted to customer service channels. This won't be an exhaustive list, but these are the ones that are most commonly used across major organizations. We have, of course, knowledge-based authentication, probably intuitively understood by everybody here to be something like your name, your email, et cetera. The problem with KBA is, of course, that this information can often be readily scraped online from people's social media profiles. Often those data points themselves are immutable. Something like your social security number, you're not going to be able to walk up to the social security agency and say, hey, somebody else got my social security number and my favorite customer service team needs to use this information. Please give me a new one so it's more secure. But the reason that it continues to be used really is its own Achilles heel. The fact that it is very easy, it doesn't require any additional equipment. You can be calling from a landline or a rotary phone, and customers still find this very easy to do. I included PINs and passcodes here, even though many people would argue they are a form of knowledge-based authentication. I think that they are infrequently used enough in customer service environments that they bear differentiating. These may or may not be used only in your customer service stack. Of course, just like passwords, customers will often reuse these, so be aware of this. They're also subject to internal or external replay if they are socially engineered. But of course, they can be quite easy. That is also my real passphrase. Please don't steal it. Next, we have mentioned with understanding that there's some controversy for having this one up here, which is SMS. Of course, security teams do not love SMS authentication because SMS is vulnerable to SIM swapping attacks, other vulnerabilities. But I continue to believe that it has a place in customer service because globally, in many different countries, mobile adoption is very good. And also, because of the behaviors of major banks, other institutions that your customers are used to working with, customers find this method pretty palatable and easy to complete. I also believe that when you're comparing it against something like knowledge-based authentication, this is a clear improvement. So it continues to, for many use cases, not the most sensitive ones, of course, have a place. If you're a very lucky duck, and you have a mobile application that has wide adoption, you can leverage something like a push notification, both to authorize the conversation with your customer service agent or any action that the agent is trying to take on your customer's behalf. The challenge, of course, with this method is that it won't work if you have a customer base that isn't exclusively mobile, they don't have good access to the data, or if you don't have that mobile application or it has spotty adoption, you won't be able to use solely this method. And it's important to remember that if you have a baseline of authentication standard for one type of customer in your organization, that is your minimum standard. Even if you have other customers using higher forms of authentication, that is your minimum. I love to talk about voice biometrics, but I'll try to keep it kind of brief. I think, before I begin, I do think that voice biometrics have a good place in customer service and in security in general. But although organizations look at this like it's the golden ticket, it seems to be passive, easy to use, you get relatively high assurance, there are some pretty important caveats that folks need to consider before you invest in this as your primary strategy in call centers. First of all, of course, they can be technically complex. This is more important if you're considering rolling your own. That's only applicable to certain size organizations. But whether you're rolling your own or you're looking at using a vendor, you need to understand that there's a difference between technologies that can identify your customer versus definitively authenticate that that is the exact customer that you believe that you should be speaking with. The other thing is a note on privacy and implementation concerns. It wouldn't do me any good or any of us any good for me to try to generalize all of the different privacy requirements that are popping up across the globe and across the states. But suffice to say, if you are collecting data about your customer, most of you will be required to gather consent to use that data. And in some cases, you may also require consent to opt in to something like biometric authentication. But here's the problem. The dirty secret is that you can have the very best customer service team on the planet, and your customer still doesn't want to talk to them. You don't want to have to take time out of your day to go solve a problem. You don't want to have a problem in the first place. So getting somebody to enroll in a system, if you don't use it across the rest of your authentication stack for something that they hope to never have to do or only do once a year, is going to be an uphill battle. Mentioned briefly because I think that this is more limited. I think that this is going to be something that, like if you're a SaaS provider or you have technical support and you're more accustomed to talking and interacting with your customer exclusively through their device already, you can leverage browser sign-in. This would be the gold standard, of course, because you can then have all of the other sign-in protections that you've invested in for your web browser, your back-end risk evaluation, MFA, all of that other goodness. But of course, it will not work for recovery. If your customer is trying to contact you because they can't sign in, they won't be able to do this. So you're going to have another method from the ones listed anyway. So it's a lot of different choices, and none of them are really perfect, right? There's a lot of imperfections that we have to kind of wade through. If you're in a position to influence this, how do you decide which one to pick? I can't give you guys a one-size-fits-all answer because it's going to be very dependent on the risk tolerances of your organization, of the different types of use cases that you pursue. But we'll talk a little bit about how you weigh these out later. I wanted to note, when I talk to different security folks, I hear a lot of frustration about, well, why wouldn't you just pick something like browser sign-in all the time? It's not acceptable to have any kind of trade-off around security. Why would we even permit something like KBA to be used in any use case? When my friend and colleague Dean Sachs talks about account recovery, he talks about the parallels that he saw in the old saying about building a house, which is that you can have it cheap, you can have it fast, you can have it good, but you can't perfectly index on all 3 points of that triangle at the same time. And similarly, when we're talking about customer service or we're talking about account recovery solutions, we have the same kind of balancing act to choose between privacy, security, and usability. The most secure way to have a database would be to simply never store data in it that is worth anyone stealing. Similarly, for customer service, the most secure way to have customer service would be to not provide it. But that solution would never be acceptable to our customers. It doesn't balance for usability at all. And when customers don't have confidence that they'll be able to get remediation or resolution for any problem that they have with you, they're going to be less likely to shop with you. So we have to find a way of finding some nuance on this triangle. Fortunately, there are other familiar identity concepts that we can apply in customer service spaces to get to a more nuanced place on what controls we apply. The concepts of authentication assurance and step-up authentication apply to our customer service teams as well. All customer data should be private, unquestionably, but different operations are objectively more or less risky when it comes to protecting and maintaining the privacy of personally identifying information. For example, as you work with your security teams to evaluate the different use cases that your business will be handling, you may determine that you have some lower risk, some very low risk operations, something like providing a replacement to a location that you already have sent an item to your customer to, and you can accept a lower standard of assurance on that because the risk of data exposure, if you have other controls in place for your customer service team, is going to be astronomically low or maybe even zero. On the other hand, if you are working to update a payment method, if you are doing account recovery, obviously this will require a higher level of assurance, a higher friction challenge. But the good news is, if your customer is accustomed to having simple, easy requests fulfilled with a low level of authentication assurance, they will be less resistant to having to complete higher tier challenges for riskier operations. Customers can understand the value when we're talking about their personal data. So it's a lot of information. I know we only have 20 minutes, so we're going kind of fast. What can you do next if you haven't worked with a customer service team before and you're thinking about the checklist that you need to go home and make for your organization? It can be a little bit overwhelming, so I've included a couple practices that I picked up over the years working in this space and working with others to try to unravel it and make it a little bit more manageable. The first thing that you have to do is you have to really clearly and deeply understand what is the current state for your customer service organization. You need to know who are the stakeholders in this space and their hierarchy of that organization, from who are the agents, what is the management reporting chain, where does it converge with corporate. You need to understand as well what is important to these folks. What are the different metrics and KPIs that they are held accountable to? In most organizations, this will be things like how long does it actually take to solve the customer concern? How satisfied is the customer? Does the customer continue to shop with us afterwards? You should also understand if there are use cases already where customer service has security concerns. You may be surprised by how much security acumen these personnel have picked up reflexively by dealing in this space. The next thing you need to do is you need to actually write down those SOPs and use cases. Begin working with your security team to create a framework for the risks that you're trying to manage, the priority that you believe those items have, and what you are going to do to control them. I included this super ugly Charlie Brown framework because I don't want to index too much on what the methodology is. I actually don't think that's very important. You can use different pieces of the OWASP or NIST frameworks, even bits of product prioritization frameworks. It doesn't matter. The most important thing is that you create something that is inspectable by other teams. It has to be written down so that you can get consensus. It needs to be self-consistent, and it needs to be adaptable. That is why I've actually up-leveled here the risks, not by particular actions that your customer service agent is going to take. If you try to do that, this is going to get stale the week after it's published because these teams change really fast. Think about how quickly you release new features or new services in your business. Customer service will get an updated SOP to help your customers with every one of those things that comes out. And you don't want to be in the position of having to make really granular decisions and trade-offs about every step in that SOP. So you need to figure out what is the core risk that you're trying to mitigate, what is the minimum acceptable criteria, minimum acceptable control that you would have for it. I titled this slide Considerations for Change Management, but I really wish that I had titled it A Plea for Empathy instead, because change management is really, really hard for customer service groups. I'd like to dispel anybody that has the illusion that customer service doesn't care about security from that misconception right now, because customer service is obsessed with our customers. That means they are obsessed with the security and data privacy of our customers. But change management is extremely difficult for these teams because they are downstream of absolutely every other service in your organization. They have only available to them the different proofs, information, and other controls that were enabled far upstream. When you were creating your account creation workflow, think about it. Did you consider how those different points of data would later be used by a customer service agent to make a decision about whether or not they could give a refund to a customer to change their password or something like that? Probably not. So customer service teams are left to adapt to only the bits of information and the controls that they have within their own environment. The other thing I would say is, as somebody who used to take these phone calls herself, I think it's so important to actually vet the different controls and changes that you'll be proposing with the frontline staff themselves. Go talk to customer service agents. Because, as I mentioned earlier, the common metrics that we have in customer service tend to be things like how fast can somebody resolve a contact? How happy is the person after I talk to them? If you are implementing changes that add churn, add time, add complexity to their day-to-day life, you're going to cause them a lot of stress. You may also negatively and unintentionally incentivize people to work around those controls if they're concerned about how this will impact their performance, if they don't understand the value, and most importantly, if you don't actually put the appropriate constraints in place to enforce it consistently. This is all that I have. I wanted to end really quickly with, first of all, a note that I could talk about this for literally hours. I also love to talk about workforce, so if you want to keep talking to me about this, you can find me on Twitter, you can find me on LinkedIn. But I had a request, which is that if you have customer service teams, start bringing them to these events. They are making security decisions every day for their business, and they deserve the same access to tools, cutting-edge information, and other like policies and like best practice updates that we have. I myself wouldn't be here talking to you today if several years ago somebody hadn't done just that for me, and they helped me connect the dots with the larger security community work that I was doing. So thank you very much. I think we have a couple minutes for Q&A. I'd love to take your questions. Great, thanks. So if folks weren't able to hear, the question was basically about, if I could summarize, what are the other kind of like back-end like customer risk assessment and scoring that you do to supplement the different authentication methods that you have? Is correct? Yeah, okay. So this presentation, just really quick, is a bit more general about customer service. It doesn't speak precisely to the practices that we use at Amazon. I can say for both Amazon and AWS that we always have many different layers, controls that are invisible. We have entire teams that work in the back end, right, to monitor for abnormalities and take action very quickly. So there are layers of defense that we use. As a more general practice, I would recommend exactly what you said, which is to ensure that you also do have those teams in place that are doing that 24/7 monitoring, that you have automated services that are evaluating customer signals like their device, other types of personal information that you can get within the bounds of your compliance and legal obligations. It's always good to have layers.
It was a really interesting point you brought up about change management. I haven't thought about that, the impact to customer service, but it seems like that's kind of at the end of the train. Are there things that AWS has done to try and keep the customer service organization informed of changes while they're in progress?
Yeah, no, I mean, so for our own groups, like I feel like we have a pretty good, like, tight relationship with our customer service team. So to kind of like generalize it for how it could be useful to other folks, like we have, depending on the teams that we have weekly or even monthly syncs that involve our customer service teams that keep them aware of what are the highest priority. For us, since we're working in security, what are the highest priority security investments that are going on that will impact their lives? We get roadmap reports from them that highlight where are the pain points, and they hold us accountable to what is the progress that we're making against those pain points. I think, again, that's something that's pretty generally applicable, that you can have those mechanisms. I also, just to talk about it being upstream a little bit, I think that people should get customer service teams involved in the requirement gathering for new validation, for new like account creation workflows that you're setting up, because things like email validation is a decision that you make at account creation time, right? Hugely valuable for customer service teams. And there are multiple other examples like that. Does it make sense?
Yeah.
Anybody else? I think we might be right at time.
I like the point about them being the first human interface. What are your thoughts on taking away the security decisioning that customer service reps have to do? Are there things that you're seeing where all of that decisioning is already done, either ahead of time before the interaction with the customer or behind the scenes while the interaction is going on? So we kind of take some of that security decisioning burden off of customer service reps. I work with them a lot, and everything you mentioned, I was nodding my head because I keep hearing the same complaints. And the biggest thing I heard from a care manager was, why are you asking my rep to figure out which kind of authentication method to use in which scenario for what kind of flow? Are there things that you're seeing where either of those ways can be eliminated?
Yeah, I think, so let me answer you as I'm moving off the stage, because I think I have to turn over my mic. Somebody else is starting in 3 minutes. But I think the question was, like, how do you take decision out for customer service, not ask them to make high judgment calls? I think we can discuss that more outside, but I think that automation with controls has a lot of value. Thank you. Thank you, folks.